My son called me senile, demanding my $3.8 million home the day after we buried his mother. He thought my grief made me weak, an easy target. But he didn't know I had just found a sealed envelope in Eleanor's jewelry box. Inside wasn't a letter of love, but the results of a DNA test that would prove he was never entitled to a single cent of our money. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. The initial shock had worn off, leaving behind a cold, hollow space where my heart used to be. I sat in my worn leather armchair, the one that still held the faint scent of Eleanor's perfume, and stared at the wedding photograph of Ethan and Sarah perched on the mantelpiece. Their smiles, once a source of warmth, now seemed like a cruel mockery. My mind drifted back, not out of fondness, but out of a desperate need to understand where it had all gone so wrong. I remembered the day I sold my prized 1968 Mustang, the car I'd spent a decade restoring. The gleam of its cherry-red paint under the afternoon sun was etched into my memory, as was the sharp pang in my chest when I handed the keys over to a stranger. But the $50,000 I got for it went straight into the down payment for their first house in the suburbs, a place with a yard for a future grandchild I'd hoped to spoil. I remembered Sarah's law school graduation, the pride swelling in my chest, and the crushing weight of the student loan debt she carried. So, for 2 years, I picked up weekend shifts at the hardware store, stocking shelves and mixing paint, my 60-year-old back aching under the fluorescent lights. Every extra paycheck went to paying off that $60,000 loan, piece by piece, so she could start her career debt-free. So they can breathe, Eleanor and I used to tell each other, as we ate another simple dinner of beans and rice, foregoing the small luxuries we'd earned. We'd canceled the trip to Italy we'd dreamed of for our 40th anniversary, telling ourselves that seeing our children succeed was our real vacation. Each sacrifice was a brick in the foundation of their lives, a foundation they now sought to shatter. Their ingratitude was a physical thing, a shard of glass twisting deeper into an old wound with every memory. I looked around the living room, a room that was no longer a sanctuary but a museum of betrayal. Every object screamed a story. The faint scratch on the oak floor by the fireplace was from Ethan's first tricycle on Christmas morning in 1988, his gleeful shrieks echoing through the house. The grand piano in the corner, its ivory keys yellowed with age, was where Eleanor had patiently taught him his first simple melodies, her gentle hands guiding his clumsy fingers. This house, this wasn't a $3.8 million asset, as Sarah had so clinically called it. It was a chronicle, built of brick and mortar, of love and laughter, of scraped knees and bedtime stories. It was the legacy of a lifetime, a testament to the values Eleanor and I had tried to instill in our son. And now, the very person created from the love within these walls wanted to liquidate it, to turn our history into a number in his bank account. The photograph on the mantel seemed to taunt me. I saw their happy faces, but all I could feel was the chilling contrast between that sunlit day and the cold, calculated cruelty of their ultimatum. The silence in the house was deafening, a stark reminder of the laughter that used to fill it. The warmth was gone, replaced by the bitter cold of betrayal. Even the sunlight slanting through the bay window felt different, illuminating not a home, but the scene of a crime against the heart. And in that moment I found myself thinking of my other son, David, the one who had passed away from cancer 5 years ago. He had been the quiet one, the thoughtful one. He would have been horrified. He would have stood by my side. The thought brought a fresh wave of pain, a reminder of yet another loss in a life that suddenly felt full of them. A few days later, driven by a restless grief, I started the heart-wrenching task of sorting through Eleanor's closet. The scent of her lavender sachets hung in the air, a comforting ghost from a happier time. As I folded her sweaters and packed away her shoes, my hand brushed against a cedar keepsake box tucked away on the top shelf. It was where she kept old letters and photographs, trinkets from our travels. I opened the lid, expecting to be met with a wave of nostalgia. Instead, nestled beneath a stack of faded postcards, I found something that didn't belong, a thick, folded sheaf of standard office paper. Puzzled, I pulled it out. It was a series of printed emails, a chain between Sarah and Ethan from 3 weeks prior. The subject line hit me like a physical blow. Strategy for A. A was for Arthur. My blood ran cold as I read Sarah's words, each one a perfectly polished stone of treachery. Ethan, we need to be decisive. Based on recent conversations, we can easily build a case for his cognitive decline. He's become increasingly sentimental, especially when it comes to Eleanor. This is both his weakness and our greatest leverage. We will frame this as an act of love, citing Eleanor's wish for his safety. A wave of nausea washed over me. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act of greed. It was a premeditated, calculated assault. They had scripted my grief, weaponized my love for my wife, and turned my deepest vulnerability into a legal strategy. This was the weapon she had unknowingly left for me. This second wound, the knowledge of their systematic, cold-blooded planning, was somehow worse than the initial shock. It was the difference between being stabbed in the heat of an argument and finding a detailed blueprint for your own murder. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window and saw the face of a fool, an old man blinded by a love he thought was reciprocated. The tears that had been my constant companions for weeks finally dried up. In their place, a cold, hard clarity began to form. Grief had given way to resolve. They had miscalculated. They had mistaken my sorrow for senility, my love for weakness. They had underestimated the man Eleanor had married, the man who had built a life from nothing. They would not win. This was no longer about protecting a house. It was about defending a life, a memory, a legacy, my legacy, and more importantly, Eleanor's. I now understood that this was not just a battle for my assets, but a battle for the truth of the life we had lived together. They wanted to rewrite our story, to erase the love and sacrifice and paint a picture of an incompetent old man who needed to be managed. But I held the real story in my hands, printed in cold black ink. I sat down at the kitchen table, the printed emails spread before me like evidence at a trial. I picked up my phone. The contact picture for Ethan showed him and Sarah on their wedding day, beaming, a picture I had taken myself. My hand trembled, not with age or sorrow, but with a simmering rage. I took a deep, steadying breath, my finger hovering over the screen. Then, with a decisive tap, I deleted the photograph. All that remained were their names, stark and impersonal. I switched the phone to silent and placed it face down on the table. For the first time in my life, I was choosing my own peace over their access to me. The silence in the house was no longer one of emptiness. It was the silence of preparation, the quiet focus of a strategist before a battle. I looked towards the empty armchair across from me, the one that had always been Eleanor's. "Eleanor, my love?" I whispered into the still air, my voice raspy but firm. "You see, don't you? I was so blind. I gave them everything, and it still wasn't enough. But not anymore. Not now. My grief had been a fog, but now it had cleared, revealing a path forward paved with cold, hard facts. Their greed had given me a gift I never wanted but desperately needed. A purpose. The living room, once a place of comfort and laughter, had now become my command center. The only light came from the small desk lamp, casting a focused glow on the incriminating emails spread across the polished wood of the dining table. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall was no longer a comforting sound of time passing peacefully. It was a countdown, each tick a second closer to a day of reckoning. They had declared war on me in my own home, using my love as their primary weapon. They had assumed I was a casualty, a relic of a bygone era to be swept aside. They didn't realize that an auditor, even a retired one, never truly stops looking for discrepancies. And I had just found the biggest one of my life, hidden not in a balance sheet but in the heart of my own family. The game they had started was not over. In fact, it had just begun, and I was about to change all the rules. The fight for my home, for my dignity, and for Eleanor's memory was now underway, and I would not be the one to lose. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 1 below to let me know you're here with me. The cold fury had given me a purpose. The next morning, I was no longer a grieving old man lost in a fog of sorrow. I was a man with a mission. The paralysis of shock had been replaced by the sharp, clear focus of a strategist. My first act was simple, yet it felt monumental. I picked up the phone, my hand steady for the first time in weeks, and dialed the number for Frank Thompson, my lawyer and my closest friend for over 40 years. When he answered, my voice didn't crack with grief. It was level, measured, and decisive. "Frank," I said, the words tasting like steel in my mouth. "It's Arthur. I need you. We have work to do." I laid out the printed emails on his polished mahogany desk the next day. As he read, his jovial face hardened, the friendly crinkles around his eyes disappearing, replaced by the grim focus of a seasoned litigator. He didn't interrupt. He just listened as I recounted the entire sordid affair, from their calculated ultimatum in my garden to the chilling discovery of their strategy in Eleanor's keepsake box. When I finished, he looked up from the papers, his eyes blazing. "The ungrateful little monsters," he breathed, his voice a low growl. "Arthur, this isn't just greed, this is a character assassination. They're trying to erase you." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "So, what's the plan? We can fight this conservatorship head-on. We'll get our own medical evaluations, character witnesses, we'll bury them in affidavits." I held up a hand. "No, Frank. A defensive fight is what they expect. It's what they've prepared for. We're not going to play their game, we're going to play mine." A slow, predatory smile spread across Frank's face. "I like the sound of that," he said. "What's the first move?" My first move was to feel the solid weight of a pen in my hand again, a feeling of control I hadn't realized I'd missed so dearly. My hand, which had trembled just days before, was now firm as I signed the documents Frank had prepared. They were simple precautionary measures, a durable power of attorney granted to Frank, and a series of instructions that would place my assets, including the $3.8 million house, into a protective trust, effectively freezing them. It was a shield, invisible to the outside world, but impenetrable. The simple act of signing my name felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow. I was a general moving his pieces into position on the board. The meeting at Frank's office the following Friday was a masterclass in deception. I wore one of Eleanor's favorite old cashmere sweaters, slightly faded and soft. I slumped in my chair, making myself look smaller, more frail. Ethan and Sarah strode in, radiating a predatory confidence. They were dressed for a corporate takeover, not a family meeting. Sarah, the consummate lawyer, took the lead, her voice smooth and patronizing as she laid out their proposal for my care. I remained silent, letting her words hang in the air like a toxic fog. I watched Ethan, saw how he fidgeted, how he couldn't quite meet my eyes. He wasn't a monster. Not entirely. He was weak, drowning in a sea of his own making, and clinging to his wife's ruthless ambition as a life raft. Sarah presented spreadsheets and architectural drawings for the upgrades they planned for the house, their house. They spoke about me as if I weren't there, discussing my future as a line item on a budget. As Sarah droned on about fiduciary responsibilities and asset optimization, a young paralegal quietly entered the room to place a glass of water in front of me. She was no older than my granddaughter would have been. She met my eyes for a fleeting second, and in them I saw not pity, but a genuine human concern. "Are you all right, Mr. Arthur?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The simple kindness from this stranger, this girl who owed me nothing, was a stark and painful contrast to the cold-blooded avarice of my own flesh and blood sitting across the table. It was like a splash of cold water to the face, washing away any lingering doubt, any residual hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. They had weaponized my love for my wife, twisted my grief into a tool for their own gain. There is a line that should never be crossed, a sacred ground in the human heart that must remain untouched by greed. If you believe that a person's deepest love and grief should be respected, not exploited, comment with the word dignity below. I let them believe they were in complete control. I let them see the tears well up in my eyes as I spoke of Eleanor, of my loneliness in the big, empty house. I played the part of the broken old man to perfection. When I finally agreed to their terms, but asked for 1 week, just 1 more week to say goodbye to my home, the relief that washed over their faces was palpable. Sarah's mask of concern slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of pure, undisguised victory. Ethan, blinded by his success, was magnanimous in his triumph, condescendingly granting me my final, pathetic request. "Of course, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with false empathy. "Take all the time you need." They thought they were being gracious. They had no idea they were walking straight into a perfectly laid trap. They left the office, confident conquerors. But the heavy oak door to the conference room didn't latch completely, leaving a small, almost imperceptible gap. Frank and I sat in silence, listening as their footsteps receded down the creaky hallway. Then, through that tiny opening, we heard Sarah's voice, no longer laced with feigned sympathy, but sharp, efficient, and cold as ice. She was on her phone. "Mark, it's Sarah," she said, her tone brisk. "It's done. Just as we planned. The asset is secured. I'll have the signature next Friday. Can you start the preliminary paperwork for the home equity line of credit?" "Yes." "The valuation is $3.8 million, no liens. I want everything ready to liquidate the moment we're on the title." I shot a look at Frank. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped his pen. Not 30 seconds had passed since their performance of loving concern, and my home, my sanctuary, had already been reduced to the asset. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Then we heard Ethan's voice, impatient and laced with a greedy excitement. "Come on, Jess. I made a reservation at Del Frisco's. Let's go celebrate. I'm starving." Del Frisco's, one of the most expensive steakhouses in Boston. A place for celebrating victories. The main door to the law firm slammed shut, cutting off their conversation. The silence that filled the room was heavy with unspoken understanding. Frank and I looked at each other. No words were necessary. I sat up straight, the slump in my shoulders gone. The weariness in my eyes evaporated, replaced by a focused, diamond-hard glint. Frank looked at me, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. "Did they take the bait?" he asked. I picked up the heavy, gold-plated pen they had left on the table, feeling its cold weight in my hand. "Hook, line, and sinker," I replied. "And Frank, I think I know exactly where we're sending our private investigator tonight." Frank's smile widened. He picked up his own phone. "Miller," he said into the receiver, "I've got a dinner reservation for you." The game was afoot, and while they were celebrating a victory they thought they had won, I was back in my basement sanctuary, my real office, preparing for the next phase. I wasn't just defending anymore. I was on the attack. I pulled up public records on my old desktop computer. It was time to run a little audit of my own. I typed Ethan's name into the search bar for the state's legal archives, and a cold, hard truth appeared on the screen. It wasn't a criminal record. It was worse. A malpractice lawsuit, filed 2 years ago, settled quietly out of court. Settlements are not cheap. And insurance premiums after a settlement, they skyrocket. The beautiful, glittering cage of wealth they had built was not just a lifestyle choice. It was a prison of debt. And my house wasn't just a desirable asset. It was their only key to escape. They weren't just greedy. They were desperate. And desperation, as I well knew, makes people reckless. They had no idea that I now held the blueprint to their desperation, the key to their downfall. They thought the game was over, but for me, it was just beginning. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 2 below to let me know you're here with me. 1 week later, my living room was no longer a sanctuary of memories. It had been transformed into a courtroom of my own making. The air, usually filled with the scent of old books and lemon polish, was thick with a tense, expectant silence. I had invited Ethan and Sarah over to sign the final papers, a phrase I used with deliberate ambiguity. They arrived precisely on time, their faces a mask of practiced sympathy, their movements stiff with impatience. But they weren't the only ones in the room. Sitting quietly on the floral sofa, a cup of chamomile tea cradled in her hands, was Mrs. Gable, my neighbor of 30 years. She had watched Ethan grow up, had brought over casseroles when Eleanor was sick, and had sat with me in quiet companionship in the weeks following her passing. Across from her, in Eleanor's favorite armchair, sat my old friend Bill, a retired history professor with whom I played chess every Tuesday. They were not just friends, they were my character witnesses, a silent jury to the proceedings about to unfold. And next to me, in his own stately chair, sat Frank Thompson, his worn leather briefcase resting on the coffee table like a sleeping lion. The stage was set. Ethan surveyed the scene, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Dad," he began, his voice tight with impatience, "what's all this? I thought this was just going to be us. We need to get this over with." Sarah placed a calming hand on his arm. but her eyes, cold and sharp, darted from Frank to Mrs. Gable, assessing them as potential threats. "Your father just wanted some support, dear," she said, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that made my teeth ache. "It's an emotional day for him." I let the silence stretch for a moment, watching them. Then I looked at Frank. "I believe we're ready to begin." Frank nodded grimly. He didn't open his briefcase right away. Instead, he turned to my friends. "Mrs. Gable," he began, his voice formal but kind. "You've known Arthur for a long time. In the past few weeks since Eleanor's passing, have you noticed any changes in him? Any decline?" Mrs. Gable set her teacup down, her gaze steady. "Decline? Heavens, no, the opposite, in fact. Arthur has been grieving, of course, but I've seen more of him lately than I have in years. He's been in his garden, he's started walking again. He seems clearer, more focused." Bill chimed in, his professor's voice resonating in the quiet room. "I can attest to that. Our chess games have become decidedly more challenging. Arthur's strategic thinking is as sharp as it's ever been. To suggest he is anything less than fully competent is, frankly, absurd. The foundation had been laid. My sanity was not in question." Sarah's smile tightened at the edges. She knew this wasn't going according to her script. "Well, that's all very comforting to hear," she said, quickly trying to regain control. "But this isn't about competency in a social setting. This is about the complex burden of managing a significant estate." She slid a glossy folder across the coffee table. "We've prepared a comprehensive plan." "I'm sure you have," Frank interrupted smoothly, finally opening his own briefcase. The click of the latches echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "But before we look at your plan, Arthur would like to review a few financial matters." He pulled out a sheaf of papers, the first of many. "This," he said, placing it on the table, "is a detailed credit report and asset summary for you, Ethan, and you, Sarah." Their faces froze. The practiced sympathy vanished, replaced by a stark, naked shock. "It appears," Frank continued, his voice devoid of emotion, "that you are carrying a second mortgage on your penthouse, credit card debt totaling over $150,000, and, Ethan, you have a rather substantial malpractice insurance premium payment coming due." Ethan's face went ashen. Sarah, however, went on the offensive. "What is this? This is an outrageous invasion of our privacy. This has nothing to do with anything," she snapped, her voice losing its polished edge. "On the contrary," I said, speaking for the first time, my voice calm and steady in a way that seemed to surprise them. "It has everything to do with everything." I reached into Frank's briefcase and pulled out my own set of papers. The printed emails. I laid them on the table, right next to their credit report. "It explains this. It explains why you would strategically plan to weaponize my grief. Why would you refer to my love for your mother as a predictable variable and my sentimentality as leverage? The feeling of being so thoroughly dismissed by your own child, of having your deepest emotions catalogued as weaknesses to be exploited, is a profound and lonely pain. It's a feeling of being erased while you're still sitting in the room. If you believe that every person, regardless of age, deserves to be seen and heard with respect, please comment with the word respect below." Sarah stared at the emails, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. Where did you get those?" she finally stammered. "Eleanor saved them," I lied, my voice cold as ice. "She was a meticulous woman, and she left something else behind, too." Frank slid another document across the table. It was old, the paper slightly yellowed, but the notary's seal was crisp and clear. "An intra-family loan agreement," Frank announced to the stunned room, "dated September 15th, 2005. For the full $350,000 of your medical school tuition, Ethan, with a modest 4% compounding interest clause." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "As you never made a single payment, the total amount due, effective immediately, is $768,954.32. The collapse began. It wasn't loud or dramatic at first. It was a quiet implosion. Sarah turned to Ethan, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "A loan?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You told me it was a gift. You swore to me it was a gift from your father." I I thought it was, Ethan stammered, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. Dad, you said. I said you could pay it back when you were established, I corrected him gently. Making nearly $1 million a year as a cardiac surgeon seems rather established to me. The first crack in their unified front had appeared. Sarah was no longer looking at me as the enemy. She was looking at her husband as a fool, or worse, a liar. But that's not all, Frank said, his timing impeccable. He reached into his briefcase and produced a small digital audio recorder. He pressed a button, and the smug, confident voices of my son and daughter-in-law filled the living room, echoing off the walls that had once heard only laughter and love. We heard them at Del Frisco's, celebrating their victory. We heard Ethan mocking my performance in the lawyer's office. We heard Sarah callously outlining their plan to liquidate the asset. And then, the final, damning words hung in the air, chilling the room to its core. The recorded voice of Sarah, clear and precise. And most importantly, he'll be supervised. Mrs. Gable gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Bill just shook his head slowly, a look of profound disgust on his face. Sarah crumpled in her chair as if her spine had dissolved, her face buried in her hands. Ethan just stared at me, tears streaming down his face, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. Dad, we. It's too late for that, Ethan, I said, my voice gentle but final. Frank, the final document, please. Frank stood up, a grim satisfaction on his face. He held up a thick, legally bound document. 2 days ago, he announced, his voice ringing with authority, Arthur executed the final instrument of the Eleanor Graham Charitable Trust. His entire estate, including this $3.8 million home, all liquid assets, and his investment portfolio, has been irrevocably transferred to the trust. He looked directly at Ethan and Sarah, his eyes like chips of flint. The house will be sold at auction next month. The proceeds will be used to fund the trust mission, providing scholarships for underprivileged students in medicine and law. Students who, one hopes, will have more character than some of the profession's current members. He let the document drop to the table with a heavy thud. His will has been amended accordingly. You are no longer beneficiaries. The trust is. Your inheritance is now the $768,000 debt you owe it. Justice. It wasn't a loud, triumphant feeling. It was a quiet, clean, and utterly complete sense of order being restored. They hadn't just lost their lifeboat. They had been anchored to their own sinking ship. As they stumbled out of the house, not looking at each other, not speaking, their shared dream of wealth having curdled into a nightmare of mutual recrimination, I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel hatred. For the first time in months, I felt nothing. Just a profound, cleansing emptiness. A sense of peace. The war was over. And I was finally free. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here with me. 6 months passed. The house sold at auction, quickly and for more than Frank had anticipated. I wasn't there to see it. I didn't need to be. That chapter of my life was closed. The final page turned. Frank handled everything with his usual quiet efficiency. He also filed the civil suit to collect on Ethan's 20-year-old debt. The wheels of justice, I learned, grind slowly, but they do grind. Through the grapevine of old family friends, I heard that Ethan and Sarah had been forced to sell their gleaming penthouse in the Seaport district. The proceeds, I imagine, were devoured by their creditors and the substantial lien Frank had placed against them. They were now living in a much smaller rented apartment in a less fashionable part of town, their lifestyle of curated success having evaporated like a morning mist. About a month after the auction, a letter arrived, forwarded from Frank's office. It was from Sarah, 12 pages, handwritten on expensive stationery. It was a masterpiece of calculated remorse, a lawyer's carefully constructed apology filled with phrases like profound regret and a catastrophic lapse in judgment. She wrote of their financial desperation, of the pressure, of how they had convinced themselves they were acting in my best interest. It was eloquent, persuasive, and utterly hollow. I read it once, then folded it neatly and dropped it into the fireplace. I didn't need their apology. An apology is for the person who gives it, a way to alleviate their own guilt. My peace, My peace had to come from somewhere else. I didn't reply. I had nothing left to say. I didn't stay in Massachusetts. The memories there were too heavy, the ghosts too vivid. With a small portion of my now liquid assets, I bought a modest two-bedroom cottage on the Oregon coast, a place where the air tastes of salt and pine, and the hills are perpetually green. The silence here is different. It isn't the heavy, grief-stricken silence of my old house. It's a peaceful silence, filled with the sound of crashing waves and the cry of gulls. It's the sound of a new beginning. I started reclaiming the parts of myself I had let atrophy over the years. I picked up my old paintbrushes, the ones I hadn't touched since before Ethan was born, and started painting the rugged coastline. My first few canvases were terrible, but the simple act of mixing colors and feeling the brush move against the canvas was a form of therapy. I reconnected with old friends, college roommates who had also retired to the West Coast. We met for coffee, talked about our grandchildren, our aching joints, and the state of the world. We talked about everything except the ugly drama that had consumed the last year of my life. I was no longer just Ethan's father or Eleanor's widower. I was just Arthur again, and it felt good. The true victory, however, wasn't in their downfall, but in what I chose to build from the ashes of my old life. The bulk of my estate, the $3.8 million fortune they had coveted, was now the seed money for the Eleanor Graham Charitable Trust. I wasn't content to let it be a faceless foundation managed by a board. I became its first, and for now, only active volunteer. My first project was to partner with a local senior center that provided legal aid and financial counseling to the elderly, many of whom were facing situations not unlike my own. 3 days a week, I would drive to the center, a cheerful, bustling place filled with the smell of coffee and the sound of chatter. I didn't offer legal advice, I left that to the professionals. I simply sat with people. I listened to their stories. I helped them sort through confusing paperwork, pointing out clauses in contracts they might have missed, explaining the difference between a power of attorney and a conservatorship. I used the skills I had honed over a 40-year career not to audit corporations, but to empower people who, like me, had been made to feel invisible. I saw the relief in their eyes when they realized they weren't alone, that they had options, and in helping them I was healing myself. My pain had been transformed into a purpose. The first scholarship from the trust was awarded a few months ago. I received a letter from the recipient, a bright young woman from a single-parent home who was now in her first year of law school, thanks to Eleanor's fund. She wrote, "You have not just given me an education. You have given me a chance to fight for people who don't have a voice." Reading those words, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had made the right choice. This was Eleanor's true legacy. Not a house or a stock portfolio, but a ripple of good in the world, a force for justice and compassion. This was a legacy that could never be tarnished, never liquidated for a luxury car or a penthouse apartment. Looking back, the lessons from this painful journey are starkly clear, etched not in anger, but in the hard-won wisdom of experience. First, a lesson for parents. To love your children is to give them both roots and wings. But love without boundaries is not a gift. It is a form of enablement. We pour our lives into our children, sacrificing our own dreams and desires to ensure they have the best possible start. But in our desire to give them everything, we sometimes fail to teach them the value of anything. We must teach them that respect is earned, not inherited, and that character is built through integrity, not purchased with the sacrifices of others. Second, a lesson for children. Gratitude is not a fleeting emotion. It is the bedrock of a decent life. When you come to view your parents not as people who have sacrificed for you, but as resources to be managed or obstacles to be overcome, you have lost more than just your moral compass. You have lost a fundamental part of your humanity. The debt you owe your parents can never be repaid with money, only with love, respect, and kindness. And finally, a lesson about human nature in this modern world. A person's true character is not revealed in how they handle adversity, but in how they behave when they believe no one is watching. Greed is a fog that can blind even the smartest people, convincing them that their desires are more important than their duties, their wants more pressing than the truth. But the truth, like a good auditor, always has a way of finding the discrepancies. In the end, integrity is the only currency that truly holds its value. Yesterday, I was walking on the beach, watching the sandpipers dart in and out of the surf. A little girl, no older than 5, was collecting seashells with her father. She toddled over to me, her face serious, and held out a small, perfect sand dollar. "This is for you," she said simply. I knelt down to her level. "Why, thank you," I said. "It's beautiful." She gave me a radiant, gap-toothed smile and then ran back to her father. I held the delicate shell in my palm, its intricate pattern a small miracle of nature. In that simple, unprompted act of kindness from a complete stranger, I found everything I had lost, and so much more. I found confirmation that the world was still a good place, that my choice to step out of the darkness and back into the light was the right one. I had found my peace. This story has been a journey through betrayal, justice, and ultimately healing. It touches on lessons that resonate with all of us. Lessons about family, about setting boundaries, and about the true meaning of legacy. Which of these lessons speaks most powerfully to you? Is it the lesson for parents about loving with wisdom, the lesson for children about gratitude, or the lesson about integrity being our most valuable asset? Please share the lesson that you'll carry with you in the comments below. Your wisdom enriches us all. The story has come to an end. I hope it has brought you valuable lessons and insights. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Goodbye, and see you again.